The name Ted Bundy still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. On the surface, he didn't look like a monster. He was charming, intelligent, and even handsome, someone who could easily gain trust in seconds. But behind that smile was something far darker, something that would go on to shock an entire nation. In the 1970s, young women across the United States began to vanish without a trace. College campuses, quiet neighborhoods, even crowded public places. No one seemed safe. The disappearances felt random, terrifyingly unpredictable. There were no clear suspects, no solid leads, just a growing sense of fear spreading from state to state. Families were left waiting for answers that never came, while authorities struggled to connect the dots. What made this case even more disturbing was how normal everything appeared. Witnesses described a polite man, sometimes wearing a cast or asking for help, using sympathy as a weapon. He didn't force his way in. He was invited, and that was the most terrifying part. Danger didn't look dangerous at all. As the body count quietly rose, so did the mystery. Who was behind these crimes? How could someone move so freely, leaving almost no evidence behind? The truth, when it finally began to surface, was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined, because this wasn't just a killer hiding in the shadows. This was a man who could stand right in front of you, smile, and you'd never suspect a thing. By the early 1970s, the United States was changing. College campuses were growing. Young people were embracing freedom, and life seemed full of opportunity. But beneath that sense of normalcy, something far more sinister was beginning to unfold. The man at the center of it all was Ted Bundy, a name that would soon become one of the most feared in American history. Bundy wasn't the kind of person anyone would suspect. He studied law, volunteered at political campaigns, and appeared to be building a respectable future. To friends and acquaintances, he was articulate and polite. He knew how to blend in, how to appear trustworthy, and most importantly, how to manipulate people's perceptions. This ability allowed him to move through society unnoticed, even as his crimes escalated. The first known incidents began in Washington, where young women started disappearing from college campuses. Many of them shared similar features, long dark hair parted in the middle. At first, these cases were treated as isolated incidents. But as more women vanished under eerily similar circumstances, investigators began to suspect a pattern. Still, they had little evidence to work with. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing a man named Ted, often described as attractive and well-spoken, sometimes wearing a fake cast or using crutches. He would ask for help, loading books into his car, carrying something heavy, and in that brief moment of trust, everything would change. It was a calculated method, one that relied not on force, but on deception. As time went on, the disappearances spread beyond Washington to places like Oregon and Utah. The lack of communication between law enforcement agencies at the time made it difficult to connect these cases across state lines. Bundy used this to his advantage, moving frequently and staying one step ahead of the authorities. Despite growing fear among the public, Bundy continued to live a double life. By day, he appeared normal, even successful. By night, he became something else entirely. His ability to separate these two identities made him even more dangerous, allowing him to operate undetected for years. What made the situation even more chilling was how close investigators actually came to catching him, yet still missed the signs. Tips were called in, suspicions were raised, but nothing seemed strong enough to pin him down. Meanwhile, the number of victims continued to rise, and the true scale of his crimes was still far from being understood. The turning point in the horrific story of Ted Bundy came in a way no one expected, bold, chaotic, and terrifyingly public. Until then, his crimes had been carried out in shadows, isolated places where he could control every detail. But in January 1978, everything escalated in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. It was a quiet night at the Chi Omega sorority house in Florida State University. Inside, students were asleep, completely unaware that a predator had already entered their home. Bundy had quietly slipped inside, moving through the darkness with chilling confidence. What followed was not just murder. It was a frenzy of violence that felt almost unreal in its brutality. He attacked multiple young women in their rooms, leaving behind a scene so disturbing that it would haunt investigators forever. 2 victims lost their lives that night, while others were severely injured. The attacks were fast, savage, and completely unpredictable. There was no attempt to hide what he had done, no careful cleanup like before. It was as if something inside him had snapped, pushing him beyond control. But the nightmare didn't end there. Just blocks away, on the same night, Bundy broke into another home and attacked a young woman, leaving her barely alive. The sheer audacity of committing multiple violent assaults in one night, in such close proximity, sent shockwaves across Florida and the entire country. People were no longer just afraid. They were panicking. This was no longer a hidden threat. This was something far more dangerous, a killer who no longer cared about staying invisible. What made this incident even more crucial was the evidence left behind. For the first time, investigators had something tangible, a bite mark on one of the victims. It was a small detail, but it would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Forensic experts began analyzing it, hoping it could finally lead them to the man responsible. Around the same time, Bundy's behavior became increasingly reckless. He had already been arrested once before in Colorado, but managed to escape custody not once, but twice, something that seemed almost unbelievable. His escapes only added to the fear, turning him into a kind of living nightmare. A man who could kill, disappear, get caught, and then vanish again. After fleeing Colorado, Bundy made his way to Florida, where he continued his violent spree. But this time, things were different. Law enforcement was closing in, and Bundy was beginning to lose control. His careful, calculated methods were being replaced by impulsive and aggressive actions. Just weeks after the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy struck again. In February 1978, he kidnapped and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school. This crime horrified the nation even further, not only because of its brutality, but because of the victim's young age. It marked a disturbing shift, showing that Bundy's violence had no limits. But this time, his luck was running out. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was finally captured in Pensacola after a routine traffic stop. The officer had no idea at first who he had pulled over, but Bundy resisted arrest, raising suspicion. Once in custody, the pieces began to fall into place. Evidence connected him to the Chi Omega murders, and the bite mark analysis became a key factor in linking him directly to the crime scene. The trial that followed was unlike anything the country had seen before. It wasn't just about justice. It became a spectacle. Bundy represented himself in court, cross-examined witnesses, and even tried to manipulate the system one last time. But the evidence was overwhelming. The charm that once helped him escape suspicion now failed him completely. When the verdict was finally delivered, it brought a sense of relief, but not closure. The scale of his crimes, the number of lives destroyed, and the years of fear he had caused could never truly be undone. The Chi Omega incident wasn't just another crime. It was the moment the mask finally shattered. The world saw Ted Bundy not as a mysterious figure hiding in the dark, but as what he truly was, a predator whose violence had spiraled completely out of control. The investigation into Ted Bundy was unlike anything law enforcement had faced before. It stretched across multiple states, involved dozens of agencies, and exposed serious flaws in how criminal cases were handled in the 1970s. At first, there was no clear suspect, just a series of disappearances and murders that seemed connected, yet impossible to prove. The lack of communication between states like Washington, Utah, and Colorado allowed Bundy to move freely, leaving behind a trail of victims without immediately drawing suspicion to himself. Early on, witnesses repeatedly mentioned a man named Ted, often seen driving a Volkswagen Beetle. Tips began pouring in, including one from a woman who knew Bundy personally. She found it strange that the description matched him, his name, his appearance, even his behavior. But like many others, she struggled to believe that someone so normal could be capable of such horrific crimes. Authorities briefly looked into him, but without solid evidence, he slipped through their fingers once again. It wasn't until 1975 in Utah that the investigation took a serious turn. Bundy was pulled over by police, and during a search of his car, officers discovered suspicious items, handcuffs, a crowbar, and other tools that suggested something far more sinister. He was arrested, initially linked to a kidnapping attempt. This marked the first real breakthrough. Investigators began connecting him to earlier cases, building a profile that finally started to make sense. As the case against him grew, Bundy faced trial and was convicted of kidnapping. But even then, the full extent of his crimes remained hidden. What followed next seemed almost unbelievable. He escaped from custody not once, but twice in Colorado. The first escape happened in a courthouse library, where he jumped out of a window and fled into the mountains. He was eventually recaptured. But the second escape was even more shocking. Bundy managed to slip through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell, disappearing into the night. These escapes turned the investigation into a nationwide crisis. Law enforcement agencies were now not only trying to solve past murders, but also prevent future ones. Bundy's ability to evade capture made him one of the most wanted fugitives in America. His name spread across headlines, and fear intensified as people realized he could be anywhere. After fleeing Colorado, Bundy traveled to Florida, where his crimes became more violent and reckless. This ultimately led to his capture in Pensacola in 1978. From that moment, the investigation shifted into its final phase, building a case strong enough to ensure he would never walk free again. The trial in Florida became a historic moment in American legal history. It was one of the first high-profile cases to be heavily televised, turning it into a media spectacle. People across the country watched as Ted Bundy, once a shadowy figure, sat in the courtroom defending himself. His decision to act as his own attorney added an unsettling dimension to proceedings. He questioned witnesses, challenged evidence, and attempted to manipulate the narrative just as he had done in real life. But this time, the evidence was too strong. The most critical piece was a forensic analysis of bite marks found on one of the victims from the Chi Omega murders. Experts matched these marks directly to Bundy's teeth, making it one of the earliest uses of this type of forensic evidence in a murder trial. In addition, eyewitness testimonies, physical evidence, and his own suspicious behavior created a case that was nearly impossible to refute. In 1979, Bundy was found guilty of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The courtroom reaction was intense, relief, anger, and disbelief all mixed together. For the families of the victims, it was a step toward justice, though nothing could undo the pain they had endured. Even after his conviction, the story didn't end. Bundy spent years on death row, during which he gave interviews and made partial confessions. Investigators used this time to uncover more details about his crimes, linking him to cases that had remained unsolved for years. Each new revelation painted an even darker picture of the man they had finally captured. On January 24th, 1989, in Florida, the sentence was carried out. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair, bringing an official end to one of the most horrifying criminal cases in American history. The investigation and trial of Bundy changed law enforcement forever. It exposed a need for better communication between agencies, improved forensic techniques, and a deeper understanding of criminal psychology. His case became a turning point, influencing how future serial crimes would be investigated and prosecuted. But beyond the procedures and policies, the impact was far more human. It was a story of lives lost, families shattered, and a nation forced to confront a terrifying reality that sometimes the most dangerous monsters don't look like monsters at all.